Mendoza, Executive Director of the democracy think tank, the Henry Jackson Society. Alan, thanks for your time this evening. Those were strong words last night from the Republicans in Washington. They are upping the ante. They are suggesting very strongly, nay, even definitively, that Chinese fingerprints are all over what's happened from Wuhan and then beyond.
Yeah, I think the Republicans haven't minced their words on this. They have concluded, based on decent intelligence assessments, based on their understanding, a commonly understood understanding of what happened in Wuhan at the Institute of Virology in 2019 and before, that there is an excellent chance that this did indeed leak from a lab as opposed to emerging from animals. So the reality is that we have this situation now where we are getting, the Chinese authorities telling us one thing, increasing evidence mounting on the other. We are waiting for the official US intelligence community report coming at some point in August, it should appear, at the instruction of President Biden. And then I think we'll know a lot more about where the US is actually heading on this debate. But what you just said was right. The direction of travel is very much in the direction that China does not want it to be, which is pointing the finger at poor standards at that lab.
Let's assume, and it is an assumption, that what the Republicans issued last night is a fair representation of ultimately what the intelligence agency's findings will be, and that points blame fairly and squarely at China. Then the question arises, what on earth do we do next? I mentioned in my introduction, I don't know if you heard it, that in terms of sanctions, I mean, that would be, in the minds of many people, folly, given that we've just managed to, or we are just beginning to extract ourselves from the economic morass caused by COVID. Why on earth would we then consider sanctions that might plough us back into it? It's a non-starter. We just have to take this on the chin.
Well, we don't have to just take it on the chin. The reality is, you actually, made some points, obviously, about, firstly, individuals can make decisions. They don't have to buy Chinese products. Secondly, governments can impose sanctions should they wish. There are international mechanisms that can be used. We can go to The Hague and look at some of the provisions there, at China's breach of the World Health Organization's regulations right at the start when they hid the fact that COVID was racing out of control. All these things do give us opportunities to hit back. And the reality is, how can we, in one of what will turn out to be one of the greatest either accidents or kind of deliberately moved along incidents in history, how can we sit back and do nothing? The reality is that if a company, for example, were to pollute a lake, we would immediately punish it with a fine of some kind. If a car manufacturer caused the car to crash, even if it was down to individual control of the car, we would demand the manufacturer pays compensation. The idea that a country can get away with this falls right in the face of what we understand to be international law and indeed the international system of justice. We have to take action, and it would really be in China's interest to come clean first and hold their hands up and say, right, we messed up, how can we put it right? That would be the
Alan,
best
it's
way.
not going to happen, is it? It's just not going to happen. I just wonder whether there is any legal mechanism internationally that can allow us to present and weigh the evidence, because the evidence, as you say, and as others are saying, is mounting, perhaps to the point of being definitive and conclusive. But where might that forum be? I'm presuming the United Nations is the only place where we could put the Chinese Communist Party in the dock and say, you may not accept this, you may not give us the reparations which we deserve. You have effectively killed 4.4 million people worldwide, and we demand justice. Where might that forum be?
You're right. I mean, one option would be the United Nations. Of course, you won't get action at the UN because China will be able to veto anything that might come out of it. But you're right. As a presentational point of view, outlining to the world what happened, outlining to the world, should the evidence be there, that this is how this dreaded virus appeared, that would be very powerful. But I do want to go back to this idea of going to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. There are provisions to do that. You could find another way of doing this would be to bring a case at The Hague in this way around the World Health Organization regulations and lay out your evidence that way. The final way it could happen, of course, as we've seen in the case of 9/11, would be for individuals or groups to come together and file class action suits. The US is the obvious place where this happens, and have criminal cases or civil cases in the States where you can again put the evidence down to point this out. So there are multiple mechanisms. What we need to be certain of first is a credible view from the intelligence community that this is actually what happened.
But you know the way, Alan, don't you, the way that international politics work, particularly at the United Nations. It is possible, and we think back to the dark days of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union had what were called client states. Well, there's a similar situation now, isn't there, where China effectively has dozens, I would submit, of client states. They're economically dependent on China every bit as much as some states were economically and militarily dependent on the old Soviet Union. And when the emergency flare goes up from Beijing, it's not unreasonable to think they will fall into line. And the idea of getting a vote in the United Nations that will punish China for what it's done, it's for the birds.
The UN will not be the punishing mechanism. As you've outlined, firstly, there are lots of water carriers for China, and you can see that, by the way, in another example. Look at the genocide unfolding in Xinjiang province against the Uyghur Muslims. You would think that the entire Muslim world, 50-plus countries, would be united in condemnation of China targeting Muslims, just as they are, in many cases, if something happens in Israel, in the Palestinian territories. And yet, not a word from most of them. Some, of course, have stood up, but many have gone, we're washing our hands of this because the Chinese pay our bills, basically. So you're absolutely right. There's a clear example already in another area of how China can hide this. It won't be so much that we get a vote in the UN. You can present in the UN, you can make a case in the UN. But I do think there are other options, whether those are individuals taking matters into their own hands or governments getting real at The Hague, taking it down a legal route rather than a, if you like, a United Nations political route, where you can have much joy and you strip out the politics and instead you leave the facts of the case to be decided by everyone at that point in time.
We live in a time where individuals, because of COVID, are called upon to make individual and very personal decisions. It can be something as prosaic as whether to wear a mask in a train station or not. I just wonder whether, in this instance, the personal can be political in the sense that we face daily often buying and purchasing decisions. And in a tiny, tiny way, we can register our anger, our fury, our indignation, our outrage at what China has done every time we go onto Amazon or another website and buy something. We can check where it's from, and it's from China. You don't need to buy it.
Absolutely right. I mean, we know we have so much information today about where products are from. We have so much information about supply chain issues. We as consumers do have power. And we've seen this in many examples. There have been cases of consumers who, because they have taken a strong moral point of view on a subject, have been able to enforce change in the shops and other places where lines are discontinued and supply chains change. And that would be indeed a very powerful message to send to China on a whole range of issues, by the way, not merely the COVID issue, but also on what they're doing to their own population, what's happening in Hong Kong, the threat China poses to the rest of the world. There are good examples for how consumers can take power into their hands, can make everyday decisions that collectively can lead to change on the international scene. So I wouldn't for a moment think that consumers have no ability here, individuals have no power, because if we come together as individuals, we do have tremendous power. And we've seen this before in human rights cases. We've seen it all over the world. You saw it in the case of apartheid South Africa. You saw it in the case of the Soviet Union when protests were held in various ways, and you got change as a result of it. The change may take a while, it can be incremental, but it does have an impact over time.